It was a clear, crisp morning in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the air smells like opportunity and the streets hum with the rhythm of the city's endless motion. But beneath the glittering skyline and sun-soaked avenues, a storm was brewing. One that had the potential to shake the very foundations of Hollywood. On this particular day, a conservative icon known for his unfiltered views, Clint Eastwood, was about to meet his match in the form of a fiery liberal reporter named Amelia Caldwell. Amelia wasn't your typical reporter. A tenacious and sharp-tongued journalist for a major liberal news network. She had a knack for pushing even the most stoic public figures to their breaking point. She had a reputation for grilling politicians, celebrities, and public figures in a way that left them squirming in their seats. And now, she had set her sights on Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and outspoken critic of modern politics. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked-about interviews in recent history. "Clint, we need to talk about your recent comments on the state of the country," Amelia said, walking into the plush studio where Eastwood was already waiting. The cameras were set, the lights were bright, and the world was about to watch as two diametrically opposed forces clashed in a verbal duel. Eastwood, sitting with his trademark stone-cold expression, didn't flinch. The man had seen it all: political battles, media wars, and decades of industry drama. But something about Amelia Caldwell intrigued him. She was different, younger, bolder, and she wasn't intimidated by his reputation. "I've been in this business a long time, Amelia," Eastwood began, his voice gravelly but calm. "But I've never had someone quite like you come at me." Amelia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "You're a relic of the past, Clint. You're stuck in your old school ways, and the world has moved on. It's time you faced the music. We need leaders who understand the struggles of the people, not those who sit in their ivory towers pretending everything is fine." A flicker of a smile tugged at Eastwood's lips, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that spoke of experience, of a man who had weathered the storms and wasn't easily shaken. "You think I'm out of touch?" he asked, his tone measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. The room seemed to hold its breath. The cameras zoomed in on Amelia's face as she prepared to deliver the zinger that would surely spark the kind of debate that would dominate headlines for days. Little did she know, Clint Eastwood had one last card to play, a card that would not only challenge her worldview but might silence her for good. And so began the battle of wits. Two icons from different worlds, facing off in a war of words that would echo through the media and beyond. As the interview continued, the tension in the room thickened. Amelia Caldwell, ever the confident journalist, leaned back in her chair and locked eyes with Clint Eastwood. She knew this was her moment to land the perfect shot, to expose the cracks in his public persona and show the world that the aging legend's views were hopelessly outdated. "Clint," she began, her voice sharp, "you talk a lot about patriotism and tradition, but where does that leave people like me? The younger generation? The ones who actually have to live in a world that's been shaped by your policies?" Eastwood's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The question had struck a nerve, but instead of lashing out, he did something unexpected. He leaned forward, his weathered face hardening with resolve. "You really think you understand the world we built?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. "You think everything I did was for nothing? What we've built? What we've fought for? It's bigger than any of us." Amelia was about to fire back with another biting remark, but before she could, the studio door opened and a flurry of activity erupted. A producer rushed in, her face flushed with urgency. "Amelia, we need to go. There's been an incident. Your father, he's in the hospital." The words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. Her father, the man who had always been her anchor, her rock, was suddenly in critical condition. The room blurred around her as the weight of the moment sank in. Her heart raced, her hands trembling. "Amelia, I'm sorry," the producer continued, her voice a blur in Amelia's mind. "We have to go. Now." Amelia blinked, her mind struggling to focus. She stood up, her legs unsteady. Clint Eastwood, a man she had come to challenge and defeat, watched her in silence. He could see the shift in her eyes, the moment when the world stopped being a stage for rhetoric and became a personal battlefield. His face softened ever so slightly, but he said nothing. Without a word, Amelia grabbed her bag and stormed out of the studio, her breath shallow and erratic. The camera crews, the lights, the once important interview, they all faded into the background as her world spiraled out of control. Back at the hospital, Amelia's emotions raged inside her. Her father's sudden health scare, the catalyst, had upended everything. The journalist, usually composed and cold, was now just a daughter, desperate to see her father and find answers. And Clint Eastwood, left in the quiet aftermath of the interview, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he'd ever expected. Amelia's mind raced as she drove toward the hospital, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her father, the man who had always been her greatest supporter, had been admitted with a heart attack, an unexpected and devastating blow. The interview, the politics, the public debate that had seemed so important just an hour ago, now felt like a distant echo, insignificant in the face of real, personal crisis. She arrived at the hospital, her thoughts swirling with questions she couldn't yet answer. Her mother was already there, pacing in the waiting room, her face pale and etched with worry. Amelia rushed to her side, not saying anything, just holding her, the weight of everything crashing down. The hospital room was sterile, filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines. Her father lay in the bed, unconscious, hooked up to monitors. Her mother looked at her with tired eyes. They don't know what happened. It was sudden. They're doing everything they can. Amelia nodded, but inside, she felt the first wave of panic. Her father had always been the strong one, the protector, the one who'd taught her to stand up for herself in a world that would try to knock her down. She had always admired his resilience, his unwavering belief that there was always a way forward. But now, staring at him in that sterile bed, helpless and frail, Amelia felt a gnawing uncertainty take root in her heart. Was she strong enough? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her editor, a simple line that cut through the fog of her fear like a blade. Clint Eastwood just doubled down on his comments. He's refusing to apologize, even after your confrontation. A sense of frustration surged through her. Of course, Clint Eastwood wouldn't back down. He never did. He was a man who had built his career on defiance, on rebellion. That was part of his legend. The Clint Eastwood who never apologized, never bent to the pressures of society. But this wasn't about his stubborn pride. This was about what his views represented. For the first time in her career, Amelia wondered if she had made a mistake. Had she pushed too hard, too fast? She hadn't expected Clint to simply capitulate, but the interview had left her feeling something she didn't usually experience: doubt. Was her approach too combative? Too harsh? In a world where the line between right and wrong seemed to be drawn more clearly than ever, had she missed something? She had always prided herself on the righteousness of her beliefs. But now, she wasn't sure anymore. Her phone buzzed again. A second message. This one from her best friend, Harper, a fellow journalist who worked for a competing network. Amelia, please. This isn't you. You know what's at stake here. Don't let him get in your head. It was a wake-up call. Harper was right. This wasn't about Clint Eastwood. This was about the fight for truth, the fight for progress, the fight for a world that was more just, more inclusive. She had to keep pushing. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted by personal turmoil or by the quiet voice of self-doubt that was beginning to whisper in her ear. But as the hours stretched on and her father remained unconscious, Amelia felt the strain of the world on her shoulders. It was more than just this interview now. It was her life, her mission. She had built her career on fighting for what she believed in. She had no choice but to face the fight head-on. The stakes had just gotten higher. This battle with Clint Eastwood wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about proving to herself and to the world that she had the strength to overcome everything: her personal fears, her doubts, and the powerful force of an icon who seemed untouchable. As the night wore on and her father's condition remained unchanged, Amelia made a decision. She would return to the studio. She would confront Eastwood again. And this time, she wouldn't back down. She couldn't afford to. The hospital waiting room felt like a suffocating prison, the walls closing in around Amelia as she fought to hold her composure. Her father's condition hadn't improved. and the longer she sat there, the harder it became to focus on anything other than the blaring uncertainty. Her thoughts kept returning to Clint Eastwood, his words, his unyielding stance. He had been so sure of himself, his convictions unshakable, and in some way, Amelia envied that. There was a part of her that wanted to wield that kind of power, that kind of certainty. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Harper. "I just saw the interview footage. Clint looks like he's about to explode. He's not playing nice anymore, and you're going to need to rethink your strategy. Trust me." Amelia's fingers hovered over the screen, her mind racing. Rethink my strategy? What was Harper talking about? Had she made a mistake? It had been clear from the start that Clint wouldn't simply back down. But now, with her father's life hanging in the balance, the pressure felt unbearable. The pressure to prove herself, to show the world that her voice mattered, was starting to feel like too much to bear. A doctor finally appeared, breaking through her internal chaos. He was the same one who had been treating her father. He gave her a solemn nod, a hint of pity in his eyes. "Miss Caldwell, I need to speak with you," he said, his voice low and cautious. She followed him down the sterile hallway, her pulse quickening. "Is he okay?" she asked, unable to keep the desperation from her voice. The doctor hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor. "We've been running tests, and there's something we need to discuss. Your father's condition is much worse than we initially thought. His heart, it's a ticking time bomb. We're looking at a potential stroke or further cardiac arrest unless we act quickly." Amelia's breath hitched. "What are you saying? Can you save him?" The doctor grimaced. "We can do everything we can, but his recovery is uncertain. We don't know how much time we have." The room spun. Time seemed to freeze. The uncertainty of her father's health, the possibility of losing him forever, hit her like a wave, knocking the wind out of her. She had always been the strong one, the driven one, the one who chased justice in the world. But this was beyond her control. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She needed to focus. She needed to do something. Amelia stepped out of the doctor's office, her mind whirling. She barely noticed the text messages coming through, the calls, the chaos that had once been her world of ambition. None of it mattered now. She found a quiet corner in the hospital lobby, trying to calm her thoughts. And that's when it hit her. The truth that had eluded her for so long. Clint Eastwood, with all his bluster and bravado, had always been a reflection of something she had never fully understood. He wasn't just stubborn for the sake of it. He was a man who had survived, who had witnessed the world change around him and refused to let it take him down. In his own way, he was as vulnerable as she felt now. That was the key. Clint wasn't some villain to defeat. He was a mirror to her own fears, her own struggle to maintain control. And that was why their clash had been so intense. Because both of them were fighting to hold on to something that might be slipping away. Amelia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She couldn't keep living for the fight alone. She needed to understand Clint, not just challenge him. The interview was no longer just about politics. It was about finding a way to heal the divides, to reconcile the parts of herself that were at war. The weight of her father's condition still pressed heavily on her chest. But now, Amelia knew. One thing for certain, the next confrontation with Clint Eastwood would be different. This time, she wasn't just going to confront his views, she was going to confront him, and herself. The studio lights burned bright as Amelia stepped back into the lion's den, a feeling of calm determination settling over her. The weight of her father's condition still loomed heavy on her heart. But something had shifted within her since that hospital hallway. She wasn't here to wage a war of words with Clint Eastwood anymore. She was here to face her own fears, to confront the person she had become and the things she had overlooked. The questions she had about herself and her father's legacy, about what it meant to fight for something, anything, had come to a head. The set was already prepared, the cameras focused, the audience waiting in hushed anticipation. Amelia had come to realize something fundamental. This was no longer just a battle of ideologies. It was about understanding. It was about finding a common humanity in a world that seemed increasingly divided. Clint Eastwood was seated in his usual position, cool, composed, as if nothing in the world could shake him. But there was something different about him now, a subtle shift that Amelia couldn't quite place. The same steely gaze, the same defiant expression, but there was a weariness behind it that wasn't there before. She took her seat opposite him, and for a moment, neither spoke. The cameras zoomed in on them, capturing the quiet tension that hung between them like a fragile thread. Amelia cleared her throat. "Clint," she began, her voice steady but laced with an intensity she hadn't expected. "Earlier, I came at you with the assumption that you were the problem, that your views, your opinions, were the cause of the division we're seeing in this country. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe we're both part of the problem." Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting the shift in tone. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Amelia exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent my whole life fighting for causes, for ideals. But somewhere, along the way, I stopped listening. I started seeing the world as black and white, right and wrong, and forgot that there's so much in between. I think I forgot what it means to understand someone, even when I don't agree with them." Clint's face softened slightly, the hardness that usually marked his expressions giving way to a flicker of something more human. "You think I don't understand?" he asked quietly. Amelia shook her head, her eyes meeting his. I think none of us understand anymore. We're all too caught up in our own stories, too afraid of seeing each other's pain. I've been so focused on making you the villain, Clint, that I've never really asked why you feel the way you do, why you think the way you do. We've been at each other's throats for years, but what if we're both just trying to hold on to something that's slipping away?" The words hung in the air like a fragile truce, the tension between them shifting to something more complicated, something less certain, but more real. Clint looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "You think it's that simple?" Clint finally asked, the challenge back in his tone, but there was less venom in it now. "You think I'm just clinging to an idea because I'm scared?" "No," Amelia answered softly. "But I think we're all scared of what we're losing, and we're all so desperate to hold on to something, anything, that we stop talking to each other. We stop listening." Clint sat back in his chair, his weathered expression softening as he regarded her. The tension had broken, but it had been replaced by something deeper, a mutual recognition. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic epiphany that tied everything together neatly. But in that moment, in the silence that followed, there was understanding. Amelia wasn't sure what would come of this conversation. She wasn't sure what would happen to her father, or how the world would view this exchange. But she knew one thing: this was the kind of conversation that mattered. Not just the ideological battles fought on TV screens, but the quiet understanding that could bridge divides. And for the first time in days, Amelia felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The final minutes of the interview passed in a calm that surprised everyone. The tension that had once filled the studio had been replaced by something softer, more contemplative. Amelia and Clint had exchanged their words, heated at times, thoughtful at others. But now, as the cameras began to wind down, there was a sense of mutual respect. There was no grand epiphany, no instant reconciliation, but both had learned something they hadn't expected to learn. Amelia stood to leave, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't been prepared for how this interview had changed her, but in a way, it had. She had entered the studio thinking she was there to tear Clint Eastwood apart, to challenge him until he cracked. Instead, she had found herself on the receiving end of his quiet defiance, and unexpectedly, his vulnerability. Clint Eastwood wasn't the enemy. He was a man, complicated and flawed, struggling in his own way. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was something she hadn't fully understood, until now. As she walked out of the studio, her phone buzzed with an update about her father. The news was good. His condition had stabilized. They were optimistic he would make a full recovery. For the first time in days, Amelia felt a sense of relief wash over her. The weight that had hung over her all this time was beginning to lift. Her father was going to be okay. And while she couldn't change the world overnight, at least she could breathe for a moment. She paused for a moment outside the studio, taking in the sun setting behind the Hollywood hills. She had come here to make a name for herself, to fight for something she believed in. But this experience had shown her that the real challenge wasn't just about winning or losing arguments. It was about finding a way to connect, to listen, and to understand Clint had been right in one way. We're all just holding on to something. Whether it's the past, the present, or a vision for the future, everyone was trying to find their place in a world that often felt like it was shifting beneath their feet. But in that shared understanding, in the raw vulnerability that had crept into their conversation, there was a glimmer of hope that things could be different. As she got into her car, Amelia felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons she had learned, for the unexpected shift in perspective, and most of all, for the chance to see Clint Eastwood not as an icon or a political adversary, but as a human being. The car hummed to life, and as she drove away from the studio, the city's skyline stretching. Before her, Amelia couldn't help but smile. The world would continue to turn, and the struggles would continue to unfold. But now, she understood a little more about how to navigate it all. Through understanding, through humility, and, above all, through listening. And in that, she had found something more valuable than any political victory. Sometimes the hardest battles, she thought, are the ones we fight within ourselves.